let's talk about sexuality. First off, it is difficult to look at the history of sexuality because it's illegal. So no one openly really talks about it unless they're like dying and then they publish a poem like Aphra Behn did. And secondly, there's no real language to describe it. Homosexual, the word, comes about in the late 19th century is when it becomes popular. So for most of this period, there's just no word to describe that kind of people. So what did people talk about? Well, first off, there is a view that develops over the modern period of the kind of person that engages in sodomy. And this includes the fop and the macaroni is a weird, that was the word used to describe him. That's this fine fellow, good looking lad on the left. Well, I say lad, I'm going to talk about that. That's possibly a vexed question. And the libertine. And there are various words that describe people who are really sexually liberal and will basically sleep with anyone is the kind of view about them. And they have, in that sense, in some ways, it's regarded as, well, okay, so that's kind of a perception of possibly same-sex relationships, but the kind of person who behaves in an effeminate way, that becomes linked to sodomy over the modern period. At the start of this period is kind of a notion that, yeah, everyone wants to commit sodomy, but you just don't do it because it's a sin. And by the end, it's, oh, there's this effeminate man who has same-sex relationships. And that's a view that's still kind of survived to this day. We still, in popular culture, view gay people as in some senses effeminate. And that arises in the 18th century. And in those ways, they have transgressed not sexual distinctions, but gender distinctions. Because there's no view of straight, bisexual, gay, there's only a view of male, female. They have lost their masculinity by behaving in these effeminate, elaborate ways. And you might note that that was strange because it was kind of the fashion to wear makeup and wear these elaborate wigs in the 18th century. And that kind of shows how contradictory society can be, unfortunately. But there is an interesting point. And Randolph Trumbach, he's a historian, he argues very controversially that by the mid-18th century, there's this very clear notion of the sodomites, and that loses the male-female part of it, and it loses the male-animal part of it, and it becomes about male-male sex. And that's when you start hearing about it more. And I'm going to read you a quote from the Oxford magazine in 1770. And it uses some quite unfortunately dehumanizing language. So kind of brace yourself for that. It kind of sucks the way they talk about people, but I think it's very interesting when describing a macaroni, which is the person depicted here, the kind of effeminate person who engages in male-male sex. And it says this, quote, "There is indeed a kind of animal, neither male nor female, a thing of the neuter gender, lately started up among us. It is called a macaroni. It talks without meaning, it smiles without pleasantry, it eats without appetite, it rides without exercise, it wenches without passion." And that kind of gives us an insight into the world of people living in the early modern era who didn't feel like they conformed to the gender and sexuality norms of their period. And these people dressed in ways that were seen as unusual, though in some ways reflected in wider populist culture. And it seems like were kind of miserable. They talk without meaning and smile without pleasantry and eat without appetite. And that's kind of a shame, but it shows that these kind of people have always existed. And as long as there is language to talk about them, they have behaved in these ways. And that's when we get to what is sexuality? And did these people always behave in these ways? And there are two main spheres, the two main sides to this argument. There's Michel Foucault and John Boswell, the two biggest people arguing on each side, and they're pictured here, these lovely lads. And they were writing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as in 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And they were both gay men. I believe they both died of AIDS, in fact. And they were writing within this very fraught political sphere where they were essentially arguing for their existence. They lived in a very homophobic period of human existence. And they were writing to try and defend their existence as gay people. And on the one hand, you have Foucault, and I'm conscious of the time, but I really don't want to skip over this because I think it's really important. You have Foucault, who he wrote a book called The History of Sexuality, where he argues that the concept of sexuality is an invention of modernity. And there are increasingly scientific understandings leading to categorizations of normal or abnormal. There's this modern obsession with pathologizing types of behavior that's led to people talking about people as straight, bisexual, and gay as these three categories. And that really that distinction doesn't exist and hasn't existed through history. People have engaged in homosexual and bisexual and heterosexual acts throughout history. And it's only now that they're being put into these definitions. And sexual pleasure has been regulated in the West for generations through discourse about what we can call natural. And there's this modern idea that managing gender and sex is seen as not just good for the individual, but good for society as well, that it benefits society if you behave in these heteronormative, cisnormative ways. That's one side. The other side is John Boswell, and he argues, he brings up same-sex unions in pre-modern Europe. So before even the medieval period, before the modern era, people, men and women were in unions that, if not recognized by the law as marriage, were still lifelong partnerships. And he argues that Christianity has erased memories of same-sex couples that existed in the ancient world. And he talks a lot about Rome and ancient Greece, for examples. And that while different societies have categorized different sexualities in different ways, there are consistencies. And he talks about straight and gay and bisexual people having always existed. And he's kind of, in some ways, committed anachronisms to justify his modern political aims, which are gay people exist, give us political rights, let us exist, which I have a lot of sympathy for, obviously. So when we say who's right, it's a big topic. And my view is it's definitely unclear. And I know people now who would argue, some of them might be watching, hello, my audience, that they feel gay in a way that they really aren't attracted to people of the opposite gender. And that feels really real to them. So when Foucault says, oh no, it's all socially constructed, they're saying, well, no, that can't be right, because how could a heteronormative society socially construct me to feeling really one-sidedly gay? I'm sure the same goes for straight people. I really don't feel any attraction towards the same sex, the same gender. But on the other hand, there aren't really there's no gay gene. There's not very strong evidence for that being a thing. The science is kind of out on that. It's unclear on either way. My take is people have incidents of attraction, and I'm happy for there to be more discussion about this afterwards, because I'm out of time and I've got 2 more slides to go. People have incidents of attraction, and it's very unclear how those can and should be categorized. I've been attracted to fewer than half of the people that I've ever met, but on average, that means I'm asexual, and that clearly isn't true. So it's very unclear, is basically my take. Were people in the past gay or straight or bisexual? Maybe, which is a really weak historian-y way of concluding, but that's the way it is.